Hello, I'm Keith Frampton, and welcome to my shop. I have a story I'd like to share with you that I think you might be interested in, and I thank you for taking the time to watch it. I've always been interested in science fiction, and particularly movies. Growing up in Northeast Ohio, I can remember watching these movies on Saturday afternoons. The story I'm about to tell you is about a dream I had about 30 years ago about a fantastic journey, and I hope you enjoy it. One day I was getting tired of the cold weather and the gloomy just atmosphere and had cabin fever. So I decided to take a walk through the woods. Even though it was cold and gloomy day, while I was hiking through the woods enjoying the fresh air, I noticed that some spring flowers were starting to poke their heads above the fallen leaves. I occasionally would get a glimpse of a rabbit or squirrel scampering a short distance from the path. Partway through the hike, I was bending over to pick up a strange-looking stick that could be used as a walking cane when a sparkle of light caught my attention in the distance. I stood up and tried to identify where it was coming from. I noticed a strange object about 100 yards up the trail, so I proceeded to walk in that direction. As I approached the object, its shape was more clearly visible. It was a shiny bubble-shaped vessel, about 8 feet across, covered with gold metallic coating with some strange-looking lights. As I approached the object, I was so nervous that my hands were shaking. I proceeded to walk around the vessel and noticed a small door was open on the side. I looked around, didn't see anybody around, so I decided to take a peek inside. I figured it was some sort of UFO. There were all kinds of lights on a control panel and some words that said time travel machine. By this time, my legs were shaking, and at this point, but something still drew me inside the vessel. As I sat down in the seat, the door automatically closed and I jumped with a panic as a voice sounded very gently and asking where I would like to go. This is crazy, I said to myself, thinking that this was some kind of dream or nightmare, and the voice asks again, very calmly, yet very persistently, expecting an answer. While thinking aloud, I asked, where can I go? And the voice responded, any place or time you would like. I thought about it for a minute and wanting to run as fast as I could to get away from this place. Yet something urged me to stay and take advantage of this opportunity. As I sat there thinking for a few minutes, I decided to give it a try. I've always wanted to attend a Cleveland Browns championship game. I know, crazy, huh? But I didn't know any dates or when they occurred. And also, keep in mind that I now live in the Baltimore area, and I had this dream and wrote this down before the Browns moved from Cleveland to Baltimore. So anyway, so I don't know the date or anything. So I asked what information the time machine needed for me to provide. And it said I could either provide a time, a date, a place, or a particular event. Okay, maybe I was in luck. I was still petrified, but I told the machine what event I wanted to travel to, and the voice came back and said, enjoy. I hope you find what you came looking for. Then it said, I will be here when you are ready to return. Nothing strange happened. No shaking or rattling or lights flashing or anything. Nothing. So I figured it was some big joke by Candid Cam or something like that. So I said bye, and the door opened. I could hardly believe my eyes. There I was standing outside Cleveland Lakefront Stadium with the familiar Browns helmet and Chief Wahoo, the Cleveland Indians, smiling back at me. I looked down on the ground and there was a ticket to today's game. The date on the ticket was December 27th, 1964. And get this, the Browns were playing, of all teams, the Baltimore Colts. I literally stepped back in time. People were all dressed strangely, and there were antique cars everywhere. Strangely enough, nobody seemed to notice the time machine or look oddly at me. I proceeded to attend the game. I've never attended a championship football game before, and it was just exciting. No one scored in the first half. However, Cleveland dominated in the second half. Jim Brown and Frank Ryan were unstoppable. Cleveland went on to win 27-0, and there was joyous celebration everywhere. It was amazing. As I was leaving the stadium after the game, I wondered if the time machine would still be where I left it, or if someone had removed it. As I approached the area where I had left it, I saw the beautiful machine there, and it seemed to be invisible to the crowds of people walking by. I opened the door and stepped inside. The voice then asked, "Would you like to travel someplace else?" Yeah, I thought about going back further in time to invest in the stock market, knowing the outcome, or to collect some items that could be sold as antiques when I got back home. However, something came to me that I remembered reading in the Sunday parade section. This was many years ago. Each week, they interview a famous person, and one of the questions they always would ask them is, who would you give anything to meet? Most of the people would say either a movie star or a sports person, but I remember Ernest Borgnine responding with Jesus Christ. I thought at the time that this was an interesting answer, and I'd like to do that too. Now, if you thought I was nervous before, you should have felt my heart now. My whole chest felt like it was going to explode. Still, something urged me onward. I'd always been fascinated with the story of he who is without sin throw the first stone. I didn't know if the time machine would be able to respond to this request, but I told the machine the event anyway. And again, the voice came back and said, "Enjoy. I hope you find what you came looking for." There I was in a back alley watching an angry mob. They were all dressed very differently from what I was used to, and I was concerned I would stand out. But again, no one seemed to pay any attention to me or the vessel I arrived in. I was concerned how I would communicate in this foreign land. But as I heard the group of men around me, I could understand everything they were saying. I thought this to be strange. But then this whole day has been far from ordinary. The angry mob was furious, chasing a young woman and cornered her against a wall with no escape. In the alley, I noticed a man sitting on the ground with a few other men, drawing in the dirt. I looked into his face of this man, and it had to be Jesus. I don't know how I knew, but it was him. Without looking up, he asked the mob what was going on. The leader of the group said that the woman was accused of adultery and that they were going to stone her to death because of her sin. He also explained that it was their legal right to kill her. She looked petrified, shaking up against the wall. Again, Jesus said without looking up that he who is without sin throw the first stone. The mob looked confused at first. Then one by one, they dropped their stones and left. After they were all gone, he looked up and asked, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." Then he said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin." I was amazed that he could disperse the angry crowd with so few simple words. Then he looked over to where I was standing. His face was so compassionate. I was just about to melt. Then he went back to drawing on the dirt and talking to his friends. I then returned to the vessel, opened the door, and stepped inside. After a few minutes, the voice asked, "Would you like to return home or travel someplace else?" I thought about this for a minute, thinking where I might choose my next stop, and I decided on seeing Jesus come back to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. There I was at the outskirts of the city. It was a gorgeous day, the sun shining with only one small dark cloud in the distance. I thought it strange at the time, but the crowd grabbed my attention. I had never seen so many people all in one place. There was so much noise and excitement that I thought it was 10 Super Bowls all in one place. I was standing in the front row by the road when I saw Jesus coming on a beautiful, brilliant white colt. Most of the people in the crowd were locals, and there were a couple dozen Roman guards. The people were going wild, throwing their coats down on the path in front of Jesus. Those who did not have coats grabbed palm leaves from the nearby trees and covered the path with them. The noise was deafening, and I saw the head soldier stop Jesus to talk to him. I can only guess what he was asking Jesus to quiet the crowd, and his reply surely was, as stated in Luke 19, verse 40, that if he did so, even the rocks would cry out. Jesus passed me. He looked at me with sad eyes, not joyous as one would expect from this electrifying parade. I sat there thinking about what I had just seen while the crowd dispersed. The next stop I chose was the upper room for the Last Supper. There I was outside a small inn. I proceeded around behind and climbed the stairs to a back room. I stepped inside with a fireplace and several tables where Jesus and his disciples were preparing for the Passover feast. I could observe the festivities from a gap in the door adjoining the room. They seemed to be enjoying themselves in good fellowship as the festivities proceeded. They appeared very familiar with the words of the Passover feast. Suddenly, Jesus took a right turn in the traditional sacred ceremony, and the disciples looked stunned and confused about what he was doing. He took the bread, broke it, and said, "Take and eat. This is my body, which is broken for you." Then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The confusion was still on their faces as they finished the feast. They did not understand what was happening or the significance of his words. I slipped out the back and waited for them to finish the feast. I wanted to continue with Jesus and the disciples in the garden, so I followed them that evening to the Mount of Olives. Jesus left Peter, James, and John while the rest of the disciples rested. I sat by a tree a short distance from them and fell asleep. I was awakened by the sound of a crowd passing by. They were soldiers being led by a servant of the high priest along with Judas. They approached Jesus and the disciples. Judas approached Jesus and kissed him on the cheek, saying, "Master." The soldiers immediately grabbed Jesus. As they did so, Peter struck the servant of the high priest with his sword, cutting off his ear. Jesus said, "Enough of this," and he touched the wounded man's ear, healing it. The disciples fled, leaving the soldiers to take Jesus away. I tried to follow them from a very safe distance, but I was so cautious I lost them. I eventually found where they had taken him. He was up on a balcony, bound and wearing a crown of thorns. The square below was jammed full of people. The crowd was extremely vicious, and they were demanding that Pilate release Barabbas, who was accused of thievery and murder. They were relentless, and their cries were deafening. Pilate finally gave in and released Barabbas. Pilate then asked what he should do with Jesus. And again, their shouts were deafening. Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him! Jesus was led through the crowd, forced to carry his own cross. The crowd cursed and spit on him as he passed by. He was very weak from having been beaten, and finally, when he could go on no more, someone was forced to carry the cross for him. As I began to proceed down a narrow side street, which was more like an alley, a maddening crowd came rushing from behind me, forcing me down the street. There was no escape, for they had pressed me onward. We continued at a frantic pace until we reached Golgotha, the place of the skull. I found myself at the foot of a small hill where two men were being hung from crosses. Just as I was trying to escape, a soldier grabbed me, handed me a hammer, and directed me towards Jesus. I turned to flee, but two other soldiers jabbed their spears into my side. I was scared to death. They directed me back towards Jesus and ordered me to nail his hands to the cross. I looked at Jesus, and he looked at me with sad but compassionate eyes. I thought about fleeing again, but the spears jabbed me again, only harder this time. I started to weep hysterically as I pounded the nails into his hands. When I was done, I ran as fast as I could to the rear of the crowd and wept again. I could not look at him for the longest time. Surely I was dreaming all of this had happened, but the blood on my hands said otherwise. Finally, I had the nerve to look up at him on the cross, and he looked down at me, still with loving eyes. I began to weep again, only this time, it was not for having driven the nails into his hands. It was for all the times I had ignored him and that he was dying for my sins. Jesus breathed his last. The sky became almost black like night. Later, I heard that the heavy curtain in the temple was torn from top to bottom. People were in a panic everywhere. I wanted to go and hide, just as I had heard the disciples had done. I finally found my way back to the time machine, opened the door, and stepped inside. As I closed the door and sat down, the familiar voice asked, "Would you like to return home?" I just wanted to rest. It had been a physically and emotionally exhausting couple of days. So I said, "Not just yet," and I fell asleep. The whole next day, I sat there thinking about the events I had witnessed and regrettably participated in. It gave me time to think about other events in my life. As Saturday night came, I knew that there was one more event I had to witness. So I asked the time machine to jump forward to early the next morning, and then I proceeded to the tomb. It was still dark as I slipped past the sleeping guards at the entrance to the burial grounds. I waited for what seemed like hours when finally the sun came up. There was a light mist in the air and heavy dew on the plants. The sun just glistened off the water droplets. I could almost feel the power of a miracle in the air. Shortly after the sun came up, a few women came down the path with the guards following them. I was above them on a hill, so they did not see me. I followed them to the ridge and could hear the guards grumbling about having to roll the heavy stone away. Then there was a panic in their voices as they approached the tomb when they saw that the stone had already been rolled away. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought it would burst out of my chest. Mary ran into the tomb to see Jesus, but as we have read, he was not there. As she came out, there were two men standing there, and she cried to them, asking what they had done with Jesus. They asked why she was seeking the living among the dead. She did not understand and was running back on the path when she saw the gardener, and she asked him if he knew who had taken Jesus. He looked at her and said, "Mary." At that moment, she knew it was Jesus. She could not believe it, yet she wanted to. He told her to go and tell the disciples of what she had seen. She and the other women ran back down the path, followed by the confused guards. My heart had not stopped pounding. As I looked back, I saw Jesus had disappeared. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm myself and reflecting on what I had witnessed. It truly was a glorious moment. I dare say the most important since the dawn of man. I finally saw that miraculous moment of Jesus' resurrection. Now I could go home. As I started to stand and descend the hill to the path, a hand touched me on the shoulder. I jumped with quite a start because I thought everyone was gone. I turned around to see Jesus standing before me. I did not know what to say, as my heart was still pounding again. He looked at me lovingly in my eyes and told me, "Go and tell of him." I had tears in my eyes. I looked down at my hands that had been bloodstained since Friday, wanting to apologize to him for what I had done. And they were clean again. I looked back up, and he was gone. I was truly forgiven. I slowly worked my way back to the time machine. I wanted this morning to last forever. I finally returned to the vessel, opened the door, and stepped inside. As I closed the door, sat down, the voice asked, "Would you like to return home?" I now was ready to return home, so I said yes. I sat back and relaxed for the short journey home. The voice said, "I hope you found what you came looking for." And I knew that I had. As I stepped out, the voice said, "May you always be filled with the love of Christ." I looked back at the vessel, and it now seemed more brilliant than I remembered. As I thanked God for my fantastic journey, it disappeared. I glanced at my watch, and it was still the same day and time as when I'd left. However, the sky had turned from a gloomy day, as when I departed, to a bright sunny day. The sun felt warm on my face as I thought about the events I had witnessed and participated in. I reached down and picked up my walking stick, feeling the presence of God as I continued my walk. As we read in John 14, chapter 14, verse 6, Jesus answered, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." In Acts chapter 4, verses 12, salvation is found in no one else. There is no one under the other name under heaven given to men by which we must be saved. We must all look to the cross for salvation. We are forgiven all our sins. Our sins were left at the cross and given the opportunity to be raised up with Christ. The hard part was done by God. All we need to do is accept this gift of grace and ask for his forgiveness. It would be a shame for such a wonderful gift to be left unclaimed. I truly did experience that journey in a strange and an unusual way, and I will never forget it as long as I live. Christ will always be with me. I pray that he goes with you also. Thank you for your time and listening to my story. It may be clear now that I tell you this story from my workshop about a carpenter, my Savior. And I pray that you have a blessed Easter. One other thing I want to share with you. A few years after I wrote this story, my wife Ann found this photo in a local store. And oh my goodness, boy, does that tell the story. Thank you for your time and have a blessed day.